What up? Welcome back to the Fractional Typology Project. My name is Titi Koshi, and today we're going to be talking about One Piece episodes 4 through 8. I just got done recording the 1 through 3 video, and I noticed that I left myself a lot of headspace, so I've tried to lower the tripod here. This is all the notes that I've taken for episodes 11 through 16. For 9 through 16, and I'm going to be actually talking about these and Usopp's arc when I finish with episode 17 and 18. I should be putting out, I hope, Usopp's arc and Sanji's arc up to episode 30, both next week. So, without further ado, let me get into it. Nami is deceptive, manipulative, and opportunistic, especially with people she thinks deserve it. The first thing she did in this episode, episode 4 or whatever, is leaving those three, admittedly scumbag pirates out to die, basically, in a boat that can't handle the storm. The concept of deserve is funny. I remember my reaction to the guy from Beetlejuice going to hell. When someone is given a punishment, it's like, oh, well, like, yep, you're going to go drown. Bye-bye. It's like, you know what drowning is like? Like, that's, what do we sentence people to? You know? Like, it was really shitty of that guy from Beetlejuice to like fuck with Astrid and basically try to steal her soul and all. But like a Beetlejuice just flicked the switch and then he fucking like screamed all the way down to hell. It was bad. And I don't know. It's interesting what we think people deserve and when. And I think part of it is like when someone commits violence against us, we see them less as human in a way that like we could relate to and understand. And I think it's on some level a defense mechanism on our part to exist ourselves, to the degree that I guess violence was required to have something decent yourself when hunter gatherer and intense competition and all this stuff, that we learned that kind of thing about interacting with other people. And I don't know, it's just interesting, the concept of deserve. I don't know. Character dynamics exist largely in contrast. Okay, let me reset my little timer here. Character dynamics exist largely in contrast. We understand characters via their local distance from one another. So, yeah, that's just something I noticed. Like, Luffy is the impulsive one, and Kobe is the organized one. It's like, Luffy is absurd, and then, Zoro is the straight talker. Like, to the degree that these dynamics exist is to the degree that we can like quickly talk about them, because there's a difference between white and black, and like that stark difference is immediately. But when you start to get into a spectrum, when you start to get into shades between white and black, then it becomes harder to establish the kind of separation that I think arbitrarily forms geopolitical distinctions. I remember reading some sort of study in college that asserted that sometimes for just the strategic game theoretic reasons of resource allocation, that irrelevant distinctions between people were made into political divisions just to better divide resources, just to have a reason to say that we're the haves and you're the have-nots. What was the one Dr. Seuss book where there's the people and then there's the people with the stars on their bellies or whatever? I don't know. People just do that sometimes. And I think that it says something about the way that we conceptualize difference and the way that we conceptualize anything at all. Because in order to not recognize everything as a homogeneous one, like I said in the FTP update video, so you have to divide things up and you have to be able to describe difference. And that to the degree that stories want to emphasize those kinds of dynamics, they play into those things. I think this is because, in part, we struggle to understand similarity because it merges into something homogeneous. How many characters are opportunistic like Nami? How is she different? Because Luffy and Zoro are not as scheming as Nami, and so the degree to which Nami is crafty like that stands in contrast. And even the way that Usopp plays into that dynamic later, Nami still occupies this unique part of it because, I think that Usopp can be honorable to almost a self-defeating degree, and Nami will be a lot of things, but Nami will not be self-defeating. Like the one immovable variable is that Nami will get the treasure, and that's an interesting set of qualities. But already that stands in contrast, and contrast is easier to talk about. Which is also the very difficult thing about analyzing media, and actually part of why I want to do the fractional typology project is to talk about characters and to compare them at scale gives a better sense of like what's going on in a wider sense, because everything else, these local distinctions, are all local, because what other characters are there like Nami, and how do they cross compare? Other opportunistic characters that share her kind of bent, what do they say about how One Piece paints that kind of opportunism? And what does that say about the greater lived texture of characters and media for what opportunistic behavior is? Like that's fundamentally what I'm trying to talk about, is that kind of nuance and cross comparison. It's also a matter of original human need to understand the shape of a phenomenon. More need, more difference. Okay? So it's like if you have a need to understand the shape of things, then you're going to have more of an in-tune understanding of what the differences are, because that allows you to better understand what's going on. Different cultures have different color words. So like depending on how much a culture needed a word to describe color, they would have these different distinctions. And then to some degree, I think that color perception can lean then on the way that you perceive the words, to understand what colors are what. And so there's a deep relationship between, an assessment of difference and then how much you interact with that. There's a quote from Lauren Malvo in the first season of Fargo, which is a show that I love, that I adore. It's probably one of my favorite shows ever, where he says, we can see more shades of green than any other color. And spoilers, the reason why is predators. Because in order to identify, snakes in bushes, it's like we would need to have an understanding of like all these different shades of green. And so that's wired in. And so regardless of how true that even is, because I don't even know how true that even is, I think there is a relationship of how much we need to understand complexity in a certain field and how much we then develop language to do so. And I think one of the things about trying to understand people is that we've never been so reliant on one another, and so it was never as important to understand the different shapes of people. It was much more important to understand the shape of power, the shape of institutions, the shape of control. And so, the efforts of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, the lectures of Machiavelli on political power, these things were much more important in like a pre-industrial revolution type thing where we're not expanding the pie, we're fighting over it. And now that we are much more interdependent on each other, it becomes much more important to understand like, okay, who are the people that we're with, and what do they want, and what do they need, and rather than this being answered by algorithms that are purely trying to extract the maximum amount of attention or incentives or benefits. It's different if you're trying to genuinely understand the dynamics of what's going on. And what better place to do that than fiction? So that's, whatever. That's, that's relevant, but the FTP, not as much to One Piece. Who was Zoro searching for? What certain man? It's like Zoro said, that he was searching for somebody, and that's how he started out. And again, what's going on there? Shanks is an interesting role model for Luffy. He's so chill. Luffy feels every conviction, and Shanks saves them for what matters. It's like Luffy is pissed off that he didn't fight Higuma, that he just laughed about being humiliated. What Shanks considers important, it's like Luffy considers every single thing that happens important. And it's interesting because even when Shanks literally loses an arm, Shanks is like, what? It's just an arm. It's like, you're what's important. People are what's important. And Luffy fights for like every single thing. But like, what is Luffy's treasure? That's especially what this goes over. It's like, what's his treasure? What does he believe in? What's worth believing in? And Shanks is an interesting role model for that, because Shanks has a pretty defined idea, I think, of what's important, and what's important is his friends. What's important is his crew. So it's a very interesting role model, because I think that Luffy could have very easily become brutal, depending on what he chose to value. And I think that early exposure to Shanks might have taught him a very different value structure that was a lot more meaningful. So, I don't know how true that is. I don't know that much about Luffy's childhood yet, but we'll see. Higuma is a generic domineering bully, I think. There's not really much to that. He's insecure. I wonder what role Makino plays in Luffy's life. Actually, now that I think about Higuma, I think that a lot of the villains of One Piece are insecure in one way or another. Like Buggy is pretty insecure, and I think Koro is too. This idea of like, Koro will never be a better pirate than Usopp. Like how deeply that assertion strikes, I think, is a meaningful thing. Shanks cares about people. Luffy, his crew, lives in general. Those are not for threatening people. In what way is that the value code of a pirate? Do pirates have values? What does freedom cost? So, in what way is that the value code of a pirate? Do pirates have values? I actually think that the conversation that Shanks and Buggy have in their flashback is very indicative of this. And I think I kind of touched on these questions in the first 3 episodes, where I talked about, what is a pirate? What do pirates value? And I think actually that the difference between Shanks and Buggy encapsulates that. Because, is a pirate sort of the ruthless accumulation of treasure? Or is a pirate doing what matters to you regardless of what anyone else says? And really we're fighting over the definition of a word, because you can have different values and fight for them. It's like there's not sort of universal, unilateral definition of being a pirate in this sense, but what does that mean? And I guess this brings that to mind. What does freedom cost? Because in order to protect Luffy, protect what was important to him, he lost his arm. And I think that a lot of pirates, let's say, would look at that and be like, that was stupid. Why protect a kid? And I think that pirates can have this kind of ruthlessness in the pursuit of their goals, but it depends on what you want and depends on what you value. And, for Shanks, it's just an arm. Obviously, Luffy is a million times more important than that. And that's interesting. That's an interesting conversation about what it means to be a pirate and what those values mean to being a pirate. Higuma is really insecure. Can't take not having booze. Takes the insults of a child too seriously. So, anyone who hurts my friends has to pay, which is what Shanks said. Does or will Luffy ever I don't know what that word is. Oh, grow. I thought that was an S. Does or will Luffy ever grow into Shanks? Only prioritizing what's important with age, aka his friends. The answer is probably yes. I don't know. We'll see. Um, how do friends operate under different institutional ends? If Luffy ever meets Kobe again, how would that work? Depending on who values what. How do they keep their friendship when they are at like fundamental odds? And what does that mean? What does it mean to keep a friendship in that kind of environment? I think about Reinhard and Wen Li from Legend of Galactic Heroes, like people who have like I think a good relationship, but are at the complete ends of like empires and ideologies. Um, and so I don't, but I haven't seen that much Legend of Galactic Heroes, so I don't know how enduringly true that is. But it makes me think about that. Um, they make Buggy so intimidating at the start, then so silly at the end. An example of subverting expectations that the show loves. And again, I do think that the show has a pattern of doing that. And I kind of talk about that in the first FTP update video of like the concept of intimidation, that they'll make a character intimidating at the beginning and then make him into a laughing stock at the end. But it's also like I don't know if they'll do that with Kuro, and I know that they did that with Buggy because Buggy's a clown. Buggy's kind of goofy. Um, it's interesting to see Buggy and the way he is at the end, because he's so sort of intimidating at the start, and that they make him so to make him into a threat. And then at the end, you see him without his body parts, and he's just fucking hands and feet, and it's like, you know, loses some of the impact of being super intimidating and all. Buggy loves being flashy. I think to compensate for his insecurity. Weirdly, I'd make a parallel to Usopp. And actually, I don't think that's that weird. I think that both Usopp and Buggy are both like at least majority voted ENTP. I think there's like the flanderized archetype that I talk about in the first update video of like, oh, they're both funny and goofy and liars and exaggerators. But I think one of the big differences is that um, I don't know. I think that Usopp really cares. I think that I think that Buggy's a little too hurt. I think that Buggy's a little too hurt and insecure to care to the degree that he might or that he could. Like I think that he deludes himself into like the degree to which Shanks, ruined him out of whatever, whatever. I think that Buggy wants to be cruel, and I think that Buggy only has such a capacity to be so. Buggy doesn't want to be as like shrimpy as he once was when he was a rookie pirate with Shanks. Um, and I think there's something to that. Something very interesting to that. I'm not even sure how much Buggy is like a bad guy, as much as like just insecure, and lets the bitterness of that drive him, because his recollection of the interaction with the Shanks is just pure delusion. Um, and he wears that insecurity very close to his chest, which is why almost anyone can call him Big Nose, and then he's just super insecure about it. Yeah. Hey, be our navigator. I can't agree with people arguing ENFP for Luffy. He's so blunt and singular. Like that's just me though. That's what I think. Um, I can kind of see it, but I just don't think that Luffy is like that routine resistant. I think that Luffy is blunt first and foremost, and like I don't even think like Luffy. Oh, Luffy's imaginative. Why? Because he wants a pirate ship with his. He's convicted. Luffy's convicted, and not to say that ENFPs can't be convicted, but like if you as an ENFP are just like convicted on this and then this and then this, and it's not this flourishing of imagination, then is that any? I don't know. I've seen much more convincing examples of any. Aang! I literally brought up Aang. You know, it's like Aang is flourishing with ideas. And that's not how Luffy is. And also, Luffy is willing to fight. Like, I would almost call Luffy like an earthbender. You know, Luffy is willing to go down. Luffy is willing to fight. Luffy has more in common with Toph than he does this sort of elusiveness of air, of Aang. So that's where I'm at. That's what I think. But you know, if you think I'm drawing a, if I'm being too narrow in the conviction of that false paradigm, you know that's valid. Um, Traits are fluid in this show. Buggy is shrewd towards Nami when it benefits the tension of the moment, but forgetful when it's comedic or builds character. The greater sense of adventure and progression is most important without sacrificing broad character consistency. Like, not to say that they have inconsistent characters, because I don't think they do. I think the characters have been very well done and very good. But the most important thing, I think, is creating the sort of broad movements of like, this is what's happening here, this is what's happening there, in order to like keep pacing. And I think the show is very engaging and entertaining as a result. Um, but I just noticed that it's like just a little subtlety that these little traits can change without disrupting broad character consistency, in order to keep the story moving in a way that's like impactful. Buggy is drawn less and less intimidating as the episodes progress, I think. When deception escalates to violence, it crosses a line for Nami, given her personal history. Like I said before, you know, she's willing to kick a guy in the balls, she's willing to knock him with a wooden stick. But anything like real violence, like killing, it's like that's not what she does. The resolve to put your life on the line. Luffy asserts that part of being a pirate is to live with whole conviction and belief. This actually is an interesting thing with because I think that some people would define piracy and piratehood as this kind of like ruthlessness. And I think that Kuro is actually a good example of that kind of ruthlessness. Which, you know, we haven't gotten to him yet, but part of Kuro is that he just doesn't want to be a pirate anymore. He doesn't want to be a part of that life. He's tired of it all. And I think that's an interesting thing because um, Luffy defines this sort of like what it means to be a pirate as putting your life on the line, of living in whole conviction and belief that you would die for this thing right here. And I think that um, a lot of this set of episodes emphasizes that. You know, like Shushu, uh, and you know the idea of the treasure, and like Mayor Boodle, you know, charging into battle and all this stuff. And Kuro is the opposite of that. Like Kuro goes to such lengths and burns so many people, like literally killing almost his entire crew, just to get rid of his name, just to, you know, live in silence. And I think that Luffy finds that really detestable because not just, you know, what he's doing to his friends. It's like that's awful because he does really deeply not value that, but also just doing all of this to run from living life. You know, it's something that like Luffy I don't think can fundamentally understand. It's just something that doesn't make sense. Um, Shushu is a fierce guard dog, but also little, an underdog. Does Luffy relate? Little Mac. Now I brought up Little Mac from Punch Out. Um, I think there's a very clear parallel between Shushu and Luffy in terms of like um, these little dudes that have these treasures that they fight for with whole conviction. Um, there's absolutely, I think, a parallel there. And the show makes it explicit, which I think I talked about. Yeah, the shop is Shushu's treasure, same as Luffy's straw hat. The relation is explicit. Moji and Buggy don't see these things as treasures. This brings things back to the Shanks question: what's worth valuing and having conviction in? People underestimate Luffy's resilience and assume he's dead, which I feel like happens on multiple occasions. Shushu put his life on the line to protect his treasure. Does Nami have a point about the ruthlessness of pirates? And I think that depends on what pirates you're talking about. Because if she's saying that about Luffy and about Shanks, like, they're different. They value something different. And I think that's actually that's a really touching thing where I think Nami redecides on joining Luffy because she sees how much the straw hat means to him. And I think that the fact that he values a treasure means that he's not like Buggy and like the rest of these pirates that just value treasure and violence and nothing else. And I think she ends up finding that sympathetic, which is why she joins. But I also think that Nami would need to at some point confront the greed inside of her. But again, there's this question of what's she doing it for? You know, why is she collecting all this money? You know, what's it for? Luffy and Shanks are I can't tell what that says. Like I almost want to say different, but I don't think that's what I wrote. I don't know. Moji destroyed it all without a second thought. Treasure as food, consumable, perishable. It's sad that a dog cannot speak their grief. Mayor Boodle is willing to put his life on the line for the town, which is his treasure. The subs say there are things a man must fight for, but that might be a mistranslation. It might be much more about human conviction. There's this like repeated motif, I think, that like draws on masculine meaning, you know, for like honor and fighting for something. And I have to wonder about that. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. Like, I think the earliest example was when Shanks was like, you know, Shanks might have said like, "Don't cry, be a man" or something. I don't know if that's true. That might not be true. I don't like explicitly remember that, so I might be misremembering like hard. Um, so if I am, you know, don't whatever. Um, I don't know. I feel like there is kind of a gendered thing going on, and actually that's a bit of Usopp's arc too, where it's like it's time for you boys to become men, you know, and protect Kaya. And it's like how much is that a gendered thing? But actually, I took it back and said it's not a gendered thing in this example because I actually think it's more of a thing about um, the personal difference between Nami and those three. Because Luffy and Zoro and in this case Boodle all have this conviction in something they like deeply believe in. And you know Nami from this more pragmatic tactical angle, which is really the real distinction in this case, not a gendered thing. You know, it's like why would you do that? That's dumb, that's stupid. You can't do that. And it's like, you know, you have to fight what you believe in. You have to put your life on the line, you know, for your treasure. And that's like the consistent I think motif of the episode. Or the episode of all these episodes of 4 through 8. And I don't think that's really a gendered thing, but I'm keeping my eye out because sometimes that language is used, but I also wonder how much that's a mistranslation from the to the subs. So promises seem very important to Luffy. It's interesting that Luffy slammed Boodle into the wall. He was in the way. Zoro was like, good thinking, he would have gotten hurt. But did Luffy care? You know? Like, he's like, oh, he was in the way. It's like, did he just want to get him out of the way? And that's literally it. It's like, all right, old man, you're done. Because I could see Luffy doing that too. I don't know. I think it's a mix of both. I think it's never fully resolved. Because then, Boodle is like, how dare they? I'm gonna go and tell him. I'm gonna tell him myself. Thank you. It's like a mix of things. Um, it plays in that dynamic in a way that subverts it. So I don't think it's cleanly resolved that way. I think it keeps the tension between the two. Kabaji is interesting. Arrogant, ruthless, Buggy's right hand man. What motivates him to stay by Buggy's side? It reminds me of the Meow Band brothers of the next episode. It's like, but I think it's more of a dynamic of like this is a person that cannot kill the big guy, so he sticks by his side. It's like this guy is very talented, but he's not more talented than the original guy, and so he just sticks around as a lackey. Um, I think that's the dynamic. I think Kabaji's a great swordsman, but Buggy's got the chop chop fruit. So like, how much can he fight against him and all this stuff? I don't know. I don't know. Nami's aversion to serious violence is interesting too. Nami saw the fight between Kabaji and Zoro and was like, I'm good. Goodbye. But I think it makes sense given her personal history. Nami loves treasure. She wears the crown just for fun. What's her motive to amass all this treasure? It's important. It's interesting how his anger at the damage to his hat reminds me of his childhood. Because Luffy is pretty chill and he's like, whatever. Even when someone attacks him, he's like, no, don't do that. But he only gets like seriously mad in a way that's reminiscent of his childhood when Buggy, messes with the hat. Buggy's delusional resentment is also interesting. You don't know what it means to be a pirate. Buggy to Shanks about loot, weakness, to be ruthless, flashy, and rich. It's like that's what Buggy values. And I think it's just a difference in how they describe being a pirate. And I definitely am more familiar, I guess, with the cultural landscape of Buggy's interpretation. But I think that Shanks is different in a way that I think that this show, stands behind much more. Shanks has this love for piratehood. And Buggy, I don't think he understands kindness, just schemes. He doesn't value Shanks saving him because he doesn't understand it. And I think that is just the insecurity and bitterness taking up so much bandwidth of how Buggy interacts with the world. It's like kindness is pity, and it's falling behind, and it's valuing someone in a way that they could betray you. Like, in terms of how Buggy conceptualizes piratehood, it's very much about like how can I scheme and get away with this and get all the loot and get out. And I think that his values are very centric in that place. Which I think that's definitely a way of being a pirate. But I think it has its pros and cons. And it's interesting how his emotional space in that sense makes it so difficult to understand why Shanks did what he did. The people of this town stick up for each other, which is very nice. And it's a very nice town. Originally, I wrote something about and that didn't make the index cards, but I think when I was originally thinking about it, it was a very optimistic perception, for the townspeople to come together even Luffy comments on that when Luffy's like, "This is a good town," it's like they found out what we did to the mayor and they came to fight for him, and it's an optimistic and kind of beautiful thing, because I think it's very easy to be cynical about large groups of people. And very easy to represent the ways that they are flawed. I think that Usopp's arc plays into that, and the fact that this is just a good town that cares about their mayor. I think it's rare. I think it's rare for a town to just be good, in a way that isn't idyllic or that isn't a setup for like and then they get attacked or something. You rarely just get to have a nice town. Nami's hesitant acceptance is interesting. Is it tsundere? I think she learned to find Luffy sympathetic. Is it tsundere? Hmm. It's a good question. It's a good question. Why? Why is she? I think she's. I don't think it's tsundere. I think that she's aloof because she is uncomfortable with the idea of like not only assisting Luffy as a pirate. She doesn't want to be part of a pirate crew. She's in a begrudging alliance, but she also is genuinely out for her own ends, and she doesn't want anything with connection with other people to interfere with that. And so there's a degree to which she draws a line emotionally to maintain the pragmatic ascension towards her goal. Even to the point I can't believe she let Zoro like just slide down the oil in the later episodes, like episode 12 or 13, 14, I don't even know, but I cannot believe she did that. It was so absurd. Um but yeah, I think that's why she does it. If I had to guess why Nami has that kind of detachment, I think it's a pragmatic thing to be with the pirates without being a pirate, and also to pursue her own ends in a way that doesn't end at sympathy. Which I think that she's a good enough person that it'll rub off more than she thinks. And I don't know. Just depends. Um, Luffy gives good people the truth because he's ready for the fight and respects that people fight, which I think is the opposite of Kuro, who sort of lies in order to make this sort of convenient journey for himself, even in ways that are heavily exploitative and ultimately parasitic. Boodle clings to the fight to do and say something. And that's it. That's all I wrote. Fight for your treasure. That's sort of the meaning of that arc. And I think that it's a good introduction to Nami and to Buggy. And now I'm going to go research Coraline and the first two Incredibles movies, and then after I put those out, um, I'll grab a couple more movies, and then it'll be. Um, I'm hoping the Usopp and Sanji videos both out by uh, Friday of next week. I don't know when, but it'll be by then. Probably Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I don't know. I don't know. Sometime in the beginning of May, in less than yeah, less than 7 days from now. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.